Sadie is on a return cruise from Hong Kong with the family of her Asian history professor. With her outgoing personality, she easily makes many friends in the cruise ship. She makes extra cash by doing other passengers' laundry and fixing their clothes. But one day, after finding something in the laundry room, Sadie begins acting strange. The family she's traveling with begin to worry about her. And that night, Sadie says she's too sick to go to dinner. Her traveling companions and crew members think they hear Sadie crying through the walls. It turns out to be the last time she's heard alive. Lurking under the surface of Sadie's overseas adventure is a secret with a violent end. Sadie's marriage at a young age put her burgeoning academic career on hold. Now divorced, she focuses on her studies and becomes close to her Asian history professor, Anthony. It's not long after that, he offers Sadie the opportunity to fly to Hong Kong on a research trip with him and his family. But with the trip coming to an end, Anthony will fly back to the US to deal with the family emergency. Meanwhile, Sadie will accompany Anthony's family on their planned return trip home to the US by ship, taking 25 days. She's never been on a ship before, so she's looking forward to the trip.
When you're going through a tough divorce, like Sadie was, distraction is key. So this is a perfect situation for her. She gets to get away from it all, escape her worries, have some fun, maybe meet someone even, just like remember that she's attractive and other people will want her. There's more fish in the sea, so to speak.
Sadie and I have known each other for a really long time. We've been friends for, it feels like forever. We went to a lot of classes together. She got married really young, and then she got divorced. It hurt. I know it hurt her a lot, and she struggled quite a bit. But she rebounded, which I thought was great to see as a friend. I really liked to see that she got her second win.
Sadie thinks a little adventure in her life will help her get over the divorce. But she doesn't know what she's in for. Sadie has settled into the trip nicely, along with Anthony's wife, Mila, and their daughter, Caitlin. Studious and loving life, Sadie writes in her diary every chance she can. She's been writing in a diary since she was a little girl and never misses an opportunity to put down what is going on in her life. Sadie develops a friendly relationship with a Chinese passenger, Pizzi, in the laundry room. They get along great, despite their age difference and the language barrier. She is also making use of her time on the boat to learn to speak and write Mandarin, with Pizzi as her willing and patient teacher. Sadie earns extra money by fixing some passengers' clothing and doing their laundry, since she's already doing it for the Blaine family.
So as a writer, this is a really neat side detail. It speaks to Sadie's character. So she's stuck on this ship for a long time, getting to know everybody, and she decides maybe she can make a little money on the side, a little side hustle going. So it's a really neat indication of who she was as a person. She's a hard worker, and she gets along with everybody. She likes people.
But then, Anthony's wife, Mila, sees something out of the ordinary. Sadie arguing with another passenger. Mila quickly hides in a doorway so she can't be seen. She sees Sadie as another daughter and doesn't want to interfere with her business. The ship docks in Savannah Harbor, the last stop before the final leg of the trip to Baltimore. There's a celebratory mood on board as the long trip is almost done. Mila invites Sadie to lunch with her and Caitlin, but unfortunately, Sadie has a migraine and decides to stay in her room and rest. Mila hopes she's well enough for the big dinner that night, where they will sit with the captain. Mila's daughter, Caitlin, thinks of Sadie as an older sister and tells her that she'll check on her after lunch. Sadie thanks her and goes back into the darkness of her room. Later on, despite her migraine, Sadie finds the energy to do some laundry, and Caitlin gladly helps. But suddenly, Caitlin finds something. Sadie's not surprised at the picture that falls out. She's almost seen it all in the laundry room. But upon closer inspection, the woman looks vaguely familiar to her. Reading the inscription on the back of the photograph rattles Sadie, and she runs out of the laundry room. Mila is surprised when Sadie barely acknowledges her in the hall. She seems distracted and rushed. Mila tries to put it out of her mind. Later on, Mila and Caitlin head back to their room for some relaxation before dinner. But suddenly, Mila is distracted when she thinks she hears Sadie through the shared wall, as their rooms are right next to each other. Mila calls Sadie's name back, but doesn't get a response. She goes back to her book, thinking she must have imagined hearing the voice.
Hearing voices on cruise ships is actually pretty common. There's so many people who die on cruise ships that often people think they're haunted and they're hearing ghosts. But what it usually is just the whirring of machinery or other mechanisms on the ship. But sometimes there are real voices. Sound really carries across water, especially in these ships, which are made of metal. Sound really can carry.
Captain Norris is doing a sweep of the ship's deck to see if anything is out of place before they cast off. It's not necessary for the captain to do this, but he's protective of this ship and the people on it. The ship's steward, Nathan, inquires about when they're shipping off to Baltimore. The captain tells him shortly before dinner. Meanwhile, Mila catches up with her husband, who is already back home. She's concerned because Sadie had an argument with someone and then ran by her, and it was like she didn't even know her. Mila's husband reassures her, but Mila can't help but think that this is out of character for Sadie.
Sadie had such an amazing and bubbly, vibrant personality. She was so cheerful all the time. It would have taken a lot for her to brush somebody off. I don't think that would ever have been in her character. Maybe Mila did have a right to worry about her, though.
The ship sets off for its final destination of Baltimore, bringing an end to the 25 days. Mila and Caitlin knock on Sadie's door, but get no answer. After knocking again, Mila hears the faint voice of Sadie on the other side of the door. She tells them she's still not feeling well and won't go to dinner. Mila notices movement under the door, which she thinks is suspicious. Mila and Caitlin reluctantly leave, but tell Sadie they'll check on her after dinner.
There's so many occasions where we might hear something and it'll seem off, but we just keep going on with our day. We don't realize until later how important it was, or that what we heard may have been somebody's last moments.
Mila goes straight to Captain Norris and tells him Sadie's feeling ill and won't be joining them. The ship's steward, Nathan, scans the room looking for someone. He gets the attention of a crew member and calls them over. He tells him to go check on Sadie. There's no answer at Sadie's door, but then the crew member thinks he hears some faint sobbing and attempts to engage Sadie to see how she is, but gets no response. He goes back to the dining room to report to Nathan.
If we can determine when a particular event took place, we start looking at all the circumstances leading up to it. Who was around? Where did it take place? Who may have seen it? And then immediately after the event takes place, what happened? Who came around then? Was anything moved? Was anything touched? Did anybody see anything afterwards? It is like a moment in time that we use as sort of the baseline.
Sadie is in no condition to respond to people at her door, even if she wanted to. She's in bad shape and sobbing and can't bring herself to get up. The crew member tells Nathan he thought he heard Sadie crying. It turns out to be the last time she is heard alive. Sadie is on a return cruise from Hong Kong with the family of her Asian history professor. With her outgoing personality, Sadie has become friendly with a lot of the passengers. Sadie keeps a diary in which she writes everything she experiences on the trip. She has taken to laundering and mending the clothes of some of the passengers she's friendly with for some extra money. She befriends a passenger from Hong Kong who teaches her to read and write Mandarin. On the second last day of the journey home, the usually sociable Sadie declines going to dinner with Mila because she's not feeling well. Sadie is a mess and is sobbing uncontrollably and barely able to move. Nathan's worried. If a guest isn't responding, then they could be in serious peril that demands immediate medical attention. He uses an emergency key to finally open the door. The crew members burst into the room and are shocked that there is no sign of Sadie. In fact, it looks like she hasn't been there for quite a while because the room looks like it hasn't been used. Just then, something catches Nathan's eye. He notices Sadie's sliding door is slightly open and his worries begin to grow. Nathan's concerned that Sadie jumped and might need immediate help.
Sadie's room doesn't really look like anything strange happened there. It doesn't look like a crime scene. But there are some indications that maybe something's a little off. Like, for instance, her sliding glass door is open. Normally, people would close that if they left their cabin.
It's your first opportunity to get a first impression. You are first able to see the level of violence that was used, what the circumstances were at the time that it happened. Was it an intimate situation? Was it just a family dinner? It sets the scene in your mind as to what may have taken place.
Upon entering the dining room, Nathan immediately alerts Captain Norris that Sadie is missing, and he thinks that they potentially have a person overboard.
So when someone is believed to have gone missing, particularly on a cruise ship, time is of the essence. We need to establish, first of all, have they gone overboard? Getting a search going underway, particularly of the surrounding area or the area where the ship has been, increases their survivability because you can't often last long in the ocean on your own. The water's much colder than anybody would anticipate.
Captain Norris orders a full-scale, all-hands-on-deck search for Sadie. Now that the ship has set sail, they won't be able to search the water around the boat. The captain tells the crew and passengers to spread out and begin a systematic search of the ship that they are trained to do when a passenger disappears. Caitlin wants to help search, but Mila tells her to stay with her, and the crew will find Sadie. Captain Norris does not take a situation like this lightly and continues to order the crew and passengers around and get them moving as fast as possible.
That's the worst possible scenario, is to have somebody either murdered or gone overboard or missing completely. So you need to do your due diligence, essentially, and make sure that there aren't other circumstances, in the sense that maybe they've just gone to get some time on their own. Maybe an event took place where they don't want to talk to somebody and they just want to be in a nice, quiet place. Murder is not always the first thing that comes to mind.
Sadie's not really the type of person that I would ever think would just go off on her own, like without telling anybody. But I guess that it's possible that she could be embarrassed or sad or any other emotion, just like anybody else.
After reassembling on the deck, no one reports seeing any sign of Sadie. Captain Norris is upset and calls it unacceptable because no one goes missing on his ship. He begins his own investigation and questions the crew and passengers for clues. The captain questions the passenger, Decker, on where his suit jacket is. Dinner was formal, and he would not have been let in without wearing one. Decker tells the captain that his jacket was being fixed by Sadie. She was fixing a lot of other passengers' clothes too. Further questioning of Decker yields no new information on Sadie's whereabouts. Decker motions to the captain that he should talk to Pizzi about Sadie. Under questioning, Pizzi fumbles to explain that he liked Sadie and they did laundry together and he was teaching her Mandarin. The captain tells him to not go far. Captain Norris orders Sadie's room to be sealed and locked for an official investigation.
Well, once evidence is gone, it's gone. You can't recreate it. You can't put something back where you thought it was. If there's a potential for a crime to have been committed and the ultimate goal is to determine what happened and prosecute somebody for that crime, the evidence needs to be preserved. So the first step needs to be to make sure nothing is disturbed in that situation.
Captain Norris orders the ship's communications officer to alert the Coast Guard that they potentially have a person overboard. This is now a body recovery mission that will involve the authorities. Sadie is a day away from being back home in the U.S. after a cruise that has brought her and her professor's family from Hong Kong to Savannah Harbor. Sadie's outgoing personality helps her make friends with the crew on this journey. She is religious about writing her thoughts and experiences in her diary. Not a day has gone by on the trip where she hasn't written about something that's happened. Sadie makes extra money on the trip by laundering and fixing fellow passengers' clothes. When Sadie doesn't make it to the final celebratory dinner on the ship, the captain, crew, and passengers are all concerned. What nobody realizes is that Sadie is nearly unconscious and barely able to stand or call for help. When they arrive, there's no sign of Sadie in her room. They race to tell Captain Norris, who orders an all-hands-on-deck search of the ship for Sadie. It turns up nothing. The captain orders the ship's communications officer to call the Coast Guard to investigate. Could it be that she jumped to her death? Captain Norris holds informal interviews until they reach the final destination of Baltimore, and the authorities arrive to take over the investigation. He takes it personally that someone disappeared from his ship and wants to find out if there was something that could have been done to prevent it. The interviews continue into the early morning hours.
So captain's ship is his domain, but With a crew that size, so large, it's almost impossible to be able to track everybody's whereabouts at every time. Some things are bound to be missed. There's no way around it. Sadie gone, vanished into thin air. The only thing that might be able to help tell what happened to her is discovering her body.
The next day, a young woman's early morning walk along Newstead Beach leads to a shocking discovery. She gets close enough to see that it's a dead body. It's Sadie. The ship has arrived at its final destination in Baltimore, but for the first time in its history, with one passenger missing. The Baltimore Police Department sends Detective Neely and Detective Yori to lead the investigation. Captain Morris quickly brings them up to speed. Neely examines the room and formulates a quick theory that Sadie probably got some bad news and jumps from her balcony into the water below. She probably thought that was the only way out of the situation. But the captain has heard from the medical examiner, and that's not what his initial conclusion is after viewing the body. Based on Sadie's bruises, suicide seems unlikely. So Detective Neely has his work cut out for him. He looks for anything that could indicate what happened to Sadie. While examining Sadie's things, Neely sees a suit jacket and questions who it belongs to. Captain Norris tells him it's probably Decker's. He already said that's where his jacket was as Sadie was fixing it. Neely wants to talk to Decker.
Well, it establishes relationships. What is Decker's relationship to the victim? It may well just be that he sought her services in the sense that he needed something repaired, or it may have been more than that. Maybe he spent time in the room and just left without taking his jacket. But it's a place to start, and it's a relationship to think about.
Neely questions Decker, looking for any ideas or threads that might help him understand Sadie's disappearance and possible murder. Decker explains that Sadie was fixing his clothes and only a friend. He tells them that he's married.
A wedding ring doesn't always guarantee that someone's going to be faithful. It doesn't always mean what it seems. And in a closed environment like a cruise ship where emotions are intensified, people are getting to know each other very quickly, or think they are, that sort of chance, that temptation of being unfaithful can be heightened.
Neely questions Pizzi about teaching Sadie Mandarin and his whereabouts last night. He tells Neely he was in the laundry room and must have lost track of time, but he swears he doesn't know where she went.
Sadie never mentioned any affair to me. I knew that she was looking for someone new in her life, but I never heard a thing about an affair.
Seeking an accurate picture of when she entered the water, Neely talks to the harbor master, who has intimate knowledge of the tides in and around the harbor. He surmises that the body must have entered the water by 6:45 p.m. to end up where it did because of the tide. Neely asks, if the body was in the water by 6:45 p.m., then who did the crew member hear sobbing in the room? Was it even Sadie?
Managing a case is very important, especially when you have multiple crime scenes and multiple jurisdictions involved. If somebody goes overboard out at sea, the ship essentially may become a crime scene. And when the body is found on land, that becomes a crime scene in a different jurisdiction. So you have different agencies investigating, and that needs to be coordinated. Everybody's got their own investigation to do, so somebody needs to take charge to ensure that all the aspects of the investigation are carried out in each jurisdiction.
Mila tells Neely about almost walking in on Sadie having an argument with someone a few days ago. She tells him it got really heated and awkward, so she left because she didn't want to be rude. But unfortunately, she didn't see who it was. Detective Neely takes note of this, along with a growing list of twisting leads.
You know, the sooner police or investigators have information to work from, the more accurate it is and the more likely you can establish the timelines that you need to move forward with the investigations.
The medical examiner is stressing to Neely's detective that the bruises on Sadie's body are consistent with being beaten, and likely she would have been unconscious by the time she hit the water. Yori needs to find Neely and tell him. According to the medical examiner, someone beat Sadie so badly that almost her entire upper body was black and blue with bruises. Neely suspects foul play and searches for any evidence in Sadie's room they may have missed.
Crime scenes aren't always what they appear. In this particular case, it seemed to be an ordinary room with nothing untoward, but it was only once you got into sort of the minutia of the articles in the room, a particular piece of evidence pointed to a suspect.
Miraculously, Neely finds Sadie's diary that either she hid herself or it accidentally fell by the bed. Either way, this could be a break in the case. He quickly bags and tags it as evidence.
So for the investigators on the scene, there's no more important piece of evidence than Sadie's diary. Diaries are great to tell us how people are feeling, their thinking, their private motivations, who they interacted with, were they having conflicts with anyone, were they in love with anyone. Diaries can tell us all sorts of different things that the person may never express to another living soul.
Well, if the diary can be established to be the victim's, if they're in her own words, in her handwriting, and that can be established, it's essentially her own words left behind for us. Their last words, their last thoughts. Identifying people that she had relationships with, whether they were good relationships or bad relationships, is something that can't be refuted. It can certainly identify a suspect, and it gives us a direction to go with confidence.
Sadie is a day away from being back home in the U.S. after a cruise from Hong Kong to Baltimore. She's been making friends with some of the other passengers on board the ship. Sadie constantly writes in her diary about everything that happens on the trip as a memory and writing exercise. When crew members check on the suspiciously ill Sadie, they discover she is nowhere to be found. The cruise ship makes it to Baltimore the next day, the same day that Sadie's body is found, washing up on shore close to Savannah Harbor. Sadie has been beaten and thrown out of the moving cruise ship. Now, investigators must uncover who did this. Detective Neely reads Sadie's diary and realizes there are two passengers he must speak with. Neely asks Pizzi if he ever got angry at Sadie. In her diary, Sadie describes seeing a darker side of Pizzi, but the entry isn't finished. Is there something more she was intending to write about him? Pizzi admits that during a lesson, he spoke harshly to Sadie. He was homesick and regrets taking his feelings out on her. But he sticks to his story that on the night of Sadie's disappearance, he was in the laundry room. With no one confirming Pizzi's alibi, Neely is suspicious, but has another suspect to question first. Sadie's diary reveals she has a secret.
This is the aha moment when everything comes to fruition.
You have people of interest at all different levels who need to be spoken with. An interview often becomes an interrogation once somebody transitions from being just a person of interest or a possible witness to now a suspect. So these interviews or interrogations require very careful plotting out of how you want to progress through the information.
Despite no lawyer present, Neely aggressively questions Decker about his real relationship with Sadie. which he continually denies. That is, until Neely pulls out Sadie's diary and shows it to Decker.
Well, I never like to ask a suspect or a person of interest a question if I don't think I know the answer to it. I don't want to give them an opportunity to tell me something that I would have to believe. I would rather know what the answer is before I ask my question. So I'm going to ask questions based on what the victim has got written in her diary. And if it's written in the diary and they're telling me something different, then I have a direction to go.
Decker can't deny the affair any longer. He admits they slept together 7 or 8 times, but that it was going to be over by the time they docked in Baltimore. It was a mistake, he says. He was lonely and is married.
Well, it's very important information. So the fact that we found out that he's married and having a relationship with the victim tells me 2 things about him. It tells me that he's dishonest and that he has a motive. If Decker didn't want his current spouse to find out about the relationship he's having with the victim, the best way for him to deal with that is to dispose of the victim. Many homicides result from intimate relationships. So Decker being in a relationship with the victim would now likely become our prime suspect.
Decker details how the affair got started. Sadie and him meet when she assists with his laundry, but it quickly turns into more. Decker convinces her to keep their relationship a secret due to his marriage back home, but swears they both knew it was only short-term and insists that he never hurt her.
Short-term, intense relationships like this can be very exciting, but only if 2 people are on the same page. If not, it's just a temporary cure for the loneliness, or can also lead to disaster.
Decker finally admits that he did see Sadie the day she disappeared, but it was to tell her again that it was over. He says she took the news badly and started hitting him. Neely continues to ask Decker about Sadie hitting him and what made her start. Decker admits he asked why she was sick. Was it because she was pregnant?
Sadie never mentioned anything to me about being pregnant, ever. And that's something she would have told me. I would have heard about that. I've never seen her acting out like violent in any way, ever. Like, she's not the type of person to be aggressive or to get angry really easily. I really can't see her ever hitting anybody.
That upset Sadie, he says, and she started hitting him, and he was just defending himself.
Interrogations take an enormous amount of time to gather all the information from the various people of interest in the event to ultimately determine who committed the crime.
When you tell the truth always stays the same. There's no need to embellish it. But when you lie, often the lies will change because people forget what they've said. So in this case, where Decker starts changing his story, it's clear to me that he was lying, because if he was telling the truth, there would be no need to change his story. It would have always stayed the same. So the fact that it kept changing as the police uncovered more information from the diary suggests very strongly that he was lying.
The questions make Decker anxious, and Neely gets him to admit that it would destroy his life if Sadie was pregnant with his child. Decker says, despite that, he wouldn't murder her, but he did leave her in the room alone. Neely doesn't trust Decker and his ever-changing story. He has him arrested as a prime suspect for Sadie's murder. Sadie is a day away from being back home in the U.S. after a cruise from Hong Kong to Baltimore. With her outgoing personality, she easily makes many friends in the cruise ship. She makes extra cash by doing other passengers' laundry and fixing their clothes. But one night, Sadie's unconscious body is violently shoved off the balcony of her room into the cold water below. It seems like Sadie made friends with the wrong person, and her body washes up on shore the following morning. The prime suspect, Decker, admits to having an affair with Sadie, but is adamant that he broke it off and never harmed her. Then the police obtain Sadie's diary that directly implicates Decker in her murder. Decker is arrested and booked to stand trial for the murder of Sadie. Decker waits nervously in his cell to be called for the trial. He proclaims his innocence to anyone that will listen. As the trial of Decker begins, the prosecution argues Decker had motive and an opportunity to kill Sadie and throw the body in the harbor, while the defense suggests Decker was nowhere around when she was murdered.
How far did all this go back? Went back to Hong Kong when her professor, Anthony, invited her on this cruise because he noticed that she seemed lonely after her divorce.
On the other side of the world, in Seattle, aspiring chef Decker gets ready for a trip to Hong Kong to study Cantonese cooking. He plans to open a restaurant with his new wife when he gets back. But then he meets Sadie on the boat ride.
The isolated environment on a cruise ship, especially a long-haul trip, can really wreak havoc on a person's mental health, on how they're feeling, on whether or not they're lonely, and it can lead them to do things that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily do. Once on the boat, it almost seemed like Sadie and Decker were destined to meet. They were both lonely, and they were both seeking a type of companionship.
Decker feels added pressure during the trial because his wife has come from their home in Seattle to support him, and he doesn't want to be found guilty. Decker's lawyers revisit Pizzi's outburst in Sadie's diary and try to redirect suspicion from their client. But the prosecution uncovers a passenger who confirms he saw Pizzi in the laundry around the time of Sadie's disappearance, clearing Pizzi. The defense paints Decker as an honorable guy that wanted to end a relationship that got out of hand. Decker claims Sadie didn't want the relationship to end and started hitting him.
Decker claims that he was so eager to get out of that room and get back to the dining room for dinner. Kind of convenient that he finds himself in a place so surrounded with people who are able and willing to alibi him.
Decker states that after he left, Sadie must have felt so bad that she jumped from the ship herself.
Well, Decker is not in a position to give me information that I'm going to rely on. He's a suspect in her disappearance, and just because he says she jumped out the window is certainly no reason for me to believe him. In the absence of any physical evidence that that's in fact the case, it wouldn't change my perspective at this point.
The prosecution points out that there is no mention of Sadie and Decker's relationship ending in her diary, or of her having suicidal thoughts.
So the fact that she had a diary and told us everything about her relationship with Decker in this diary would indicate to me that she would likely write something in there about the relationship ending and the fact that she was going to take her own life. There's nothing about that in the diary.
Sadie would not commit suicide. Just who she is, her personality, she would never dwell on the darkness, the negative stuff of life. She's been through a lot. Even through the divorce, she always maintained her positive attitude. I mean, that's why she went on this trip. I just know she would never do that.
The prosecution concedes there is part of the defense they agree with, that Sadie and Decker were having an affair, but everything else is false. Both the prosecution and defense agree on events up to this point. The defense claims that this is where Sadie tells Decker she is pregnant, causing him to become enraged and start beating her and throwing her around the room.
It's possible that what the crew member heard was actually Sadie trying to get help or fighting off her attacker. He could have heard something very important.
Decker knows he's got precious little time before people come to the room and makes a deadly decision. Decker shoves Sadie onto the bed, knocking her unconscious.
If this was in fact a crime of passion, Decker had two options once he'd hurt her. He could either try to get her medical help, try to save her life, or he could do everything he could to cover up the crime, including getting rid of the body. Unfortunately, it appears he chose the latter.
Decker opens the window and scans to see if anyone is watching. After dumping the body, he waits to hear the splash of Sadie's body hitting the water below.
The fall from the ship, great height, several stories high, so the impact with the water can leave a person incapacitated or dead.
If Decker did throw Sadie overboard, he must have cleaned up afterward to hide any sign of a struggle. But he missed one important detail.
Criminals are often in a hurry to clean up evidence of the crime that they've committed, and they often overlook simple things. The room was cleaned up and it looked tidy for all intents and purposes, but the suspect neglected to read the victim's diary, which ultimately pointed to them as being the suspect.
Sadie trusts her diary with all of her secrets. But will they be enough to convict Decker? Sadie's untimely murder has rocked the small community of her family and friends. Her joy of life was contagious, and they might never know why that was taken from them. Decker is found innocent in the murder of his lover Sadie by an all-male jury.
So what we have in this particular case is a lot of circumstantial evidence. We know that they had a relationship. We know he was likely in her room at some point. But all this circumstantial evidence is still not enough for a conviction in this case.
Decker returns home to his wife and career, leaving the death of Sadie behind him, despite being caught in several lies during the trial. The final results of the autopsy arrive. Water found in Sadie's lungs shows she drowned, but they find something else too.
In this particular case, Sadie was found to be not pregnant after the results of the autopsy came back.
She still could have told Decker that she was pregnant. We don't know for sure, but we do know that she wasn't actually pregnant. When Decker's found innocent, it begs the bigger question, then who killed Sadie? Was Sadie having an affair with a different man? Was another man in love with her and jealous of Decker? And if so, why wasn't his name in Sadie's diary? With so many people on the ship, it's probably never possible for us to know. Someone definitely got away with murder.
I hope that women in similar situations get the justice that Sadie never got.